Thanks, Rick. So Rick called me a little while ago and asked me just to give my talking points or thoughts on my period of Indigenous engagement for mining and exploration. And basically that's what I'll do. They're really just my thoughts and notes. I started work, as Rick said, at MIM, and we met at Hilton Mine and we bumped into each other over the years. Primarily, I'm an exploration geologist, done gold in Australia, and then in 1997 went to work on a silver lead zinc project in central Arnhem Land. A small project, but one that had an Aboriginal community sited on top of that. And so I went up and did 2 field seasons, basically camped on the river after I negotiated the access, which wasn't particularly difficult. It was a little bit time consuming, as these things always are. And the 2 years I spent there on the ground with Aboriginal people, for me, gave me a real insight into how their communities work, how they relate to the culture and the land, the central role that relationships play in how they perceive the world. And I met a lot of people who, by good fortune, were significant in the Aboriginal community in Northern Australia. Because whilst we might talk about Arnhem Land and the territory, you'll find the family ties and the other connections run right across Northern Australia and down into Central Australia. So I enjoyed that period, and then I went away from Indigenous engagement and lead zinc and did gold, and then a geologist from Canada who had also worked with me at MIM came back to Australia, and they pegged the Westmoreland uranium. They were interested in the Westmoreland uranium project, which is near Doomadgee and Burketown in northwest Queensland, which many of you will know. And he came back to ask about the potential to move exploration forward at Westmoreland. And generally everyone said it was impossible. And I was naive or foolish enough to say, well, nothing's impossible if you approach it the right way. And so for a period there, I led the team, as it were, to get access, to get the tenements granted, which led to drilling and the resource there. And of course, the downturn in uranium put that on hold. I'd also done some uranium work in Western Arnhem Land, just to the south of Narberlek. Again, engaging with Aboriginal people around uranium, which is a touchy issue both for them and for most Westerners or those of us. And then really leading out of the Rio had an involvement at Westmoreland, and we'd done a deal to buy data from them, or to at least data from them. And coming out of that and the success we'd had there, we started a dialogue around the Blue Mud Bay tenements in eastern Arnhem Land. The Blue Mud Bay prospect had been known for a long time. Original applications made in the late 60s, early 70s. And because of the way the Aboriginal Land Rights Act had evolved and the Northern Land Council had evolved, for one reason or another, those had not ever been granted. And so with a junior company, we did a deal on the basis that I'd endeavour to get the tenements granted and drill that target. And then leading through to presently, we're obviously sitting in high vis in central Queensland and not in San Francisco, and sort of at work dealing with a different native title group here. So that's a little summary. I thought I'd just make some key points, then give a little bit more on the background of the work I've done and some final comments. And they're all just little takeaway comments that I've put together. So for me, the key thing with the Indigenous people is relationships. As I said, that's the basis of the culture. Some incredibly complex, tangled, what we might call tribal and then totem lines that run across Australia and tie them together. My personal feeling is that the negotiator, whoever's going to present in front of these people, probably needs to follow on the ground, because whilst you might think it's a company, it's always you. And you're the person that they're looking to carry that forward, whatever you've presented. It's quite a small community and they're well connected. And as such, it's like being in a country town in Australia and casting aspersions about someone in the pub. They're probably related to the person that you're talking about. So you always want to be fairly careful. Local issues and history and recent triggers, obviously important as with any society. As I said, that to conflate the individual and corporate entity is where I think companies make a lot of errors. The person isn't really looking at a company, they're really looking at an individual. And to swap those people in and out a lot, I think creates confusion or potentially mistrust. To some degree, we look upon the groups as an opponent or someone to be overcome, I guess. And I put it that, as the Stoics have a saying that someone used as a book title, that the obstacle is the way. These people can help you enormously once you develop that relationship, both with your work programs, but also as projects go on, they become an advocate for your project if you've developed a relationship in a good way. So around the Indigenous people, both statutory and otherwise, you've got various gatekeepers, lawyers, land councils, advisors, gun for hire access facilitators, all these people that you need to be aware of them as you enter the process. And sometimes people that present as a benefit might actually become a hindrance. And then people in the statutory roles, often people have gone and sought jobs with land councils or with the NLC because they perceive the world in a certain way. And that can certainly impact to some extent on the statutory role they might otherwise have. Then I mentioned for myself NGOs, who are groups who are well organised and often well funded, very capable, and their interests and their messaging may not align with mineral exploration and development. So as always, be aware. You have to manage meetings of up to 50 or 60 people, and you'll get hostility towards you, but also hostility within the groups. It's noteworthy that in Australia, a lot of political seats that are dominated by Indigenous people consistently elect basically white politicians. It's because the divisions within the groups, it's kind of like the Balkans, mean that nobody can decide and they'll choose a neutral person. So you're not really dealing with a homogenous body that all agree with each other. It can become quite contested at times. You'll be promoting mineral exploration and there'll be some that agree and some that don't agree. Culturally, they don't really want to argue with one another. And that can generate some dynamics that you need to be aware of in meetings. Personally, I like Peter Sandman's books and courses on outrage. Obviously, he started that process with 3 Mile Island. And for me, it's beneficial to have a structure that you can approach things with and say, well, I have a better understanding of what the dynamics are here and how to work through them. Sometimes it's hard to invite the rage, but then it can get it out of the way and people can calm down and get on with what you want to do. In terms of support, obviously Scott will follow me up. I think having a good lawyer is invaluable. There's a lot of pitfalls and traps, as well as it gives you someone else to basically game theory meetings with, and change your tack if that's necessary. So Scott's been an invaluable partner in what I've done. Corporate cost and time. Look, directors and CEOs, they always want it done next week for $2, and these things don't take that. You're much better off sort those things out early with the company, because it's going to take longer. It's going to cost more possibly than they can imagine. And part of that is to really know what tenure you want and don't want, because you don't want to get caught up battling for tenements that really don't have a lot of merit in your short-term outlook. So, as with everything, teamwork and a goal focus. Get local knowledge. You can talk to local councillors, politicians, etc. They're interested in what's going on in their district. They often know all the people. They know the local issues, whether they agree or don't. And it can be a fairly simple way to go and understand what's happening on the ground. So for me, on the ground, as I said, Bullman in 97, camped there, enjoyed the company of the people. They were very helpful. I learned a lot just by being there and engaging with them. They were interested. That was a time, as I'll say later, before smartphones and the internet was significant. And I think that time from 97 and throughout my period of engaging with Indigenous people, you see a great change, because suddenly they're not being fed information by people with vested interests. They're engaging with other Indigenous groups globally, and they can look at the news, they can see what's happening to other groups elsewhere, and they too can have Zoom conferences, etc. And that's helped. I think it's helped immensely, because they have a broader knowledge base, they have heightened expectations and aspirations. And to me, the mineral industry in Northern Australia feeds into that. Although we get criticised, if you look, there's tremendous benefits have flowed from mining in Northern Australia, and those people are aware of that now. I say, I'm not here really to talk about Arnhem Land, but the NLC meetings under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act, you get one meeting, an initial meeting. You get sat over there under a tree. Whoever's running the meeting talks to the people. Then you walk across. Now the scene's been set for you, and it depends whether that facilitator or mining officer is pro or anti, and who's spoken out at the meeting. So again, you really want to have your preparation done. And for me, preferentially, you'll be known to at least some of those people, because the gap between being an individual with some credibility and being a complete stranger is a vast gulf to try and leap over. And obviously patience is a key thing. Let's move on to Westmoreland uranium. So Rio Tinto exploration had the Westmoreland uranium MLs. A similar time they had them for a fair while, but they discovered Century, and they're bringing Century forward, and they, I guess, clashed to some degree with the native title group up there, led by Murrindoo Yana. So Murrindoo's Gangalita man lives in Burketown, very assertive, very smart. He trained with the ABC, the Australian Broadcasting Corporation in Townsville, so he understood the media, and he was a person to be reckoned with, lightly. In the time when I went to request the grant of the uranium exploration licences, he'd been the keynote speaker the prior year at an anti-uranium conference organised by some of the left-wing NGOs in Central Australia. Rio had dropped those mining leases during that period when there was a lot of tension around licensing Century. Later in the piece, after Rio had left, Murrindoo would do things like take some women and children and go and occupy the mess hall, and then the police would come to evict them. And his point was, well, we've got the media here to watch as you evict these old people instead of meeting the commitments that you have made. So he was a man to be reckoned with. So I went up there, I talked to the company about they had to offer something serious, and they were prepared to put in an equity share and move that forward. So in that, I'd known some people in the native title group, and we moved that forward without any problem. Now, I see I'm running out of time rapidly, Rick. So, Scott, are you there? Do you want to take over for a while, and I can probably make a few comments at the end?
Sure, Greg. No problem. Thank you.
Sorry.
And can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So yeah, thanks, Greg. And yeah, I've had the privilege of working with Greg for about 15 years now, and I've certainly learned a lot from him in the course of this of that work. I'll speak very briefly. I was really just going to talk about some agreement making trends that we're seeing in the native title space at the moment. It is a very interesting time in the native title agreement making space, and that's driven by a number of factors which possibly the subsequent speakers that unfortunately I'd love to stick around to hear from Kieran and Sarah and Joel, but unfortunately I can't. So, but there's some of these factors may be relevant to what they're talking about as well. But the factors include obviously the events involving Rio Tinto and Duncan Gorge and the Commonwealth Parliamentary Inquiry, which is actually now taking evidence in Queensland at the moment. Developments in the law, particularly in relation to emerging native title compensation claims, general ESG and free, prior and informed consent concepts of informing stakeholder and investor expectations. And finally, significant capacity building amongst native title parties as we're seeing more and more determinations, including consent determinations of native title and the establishment of prescribed body corporates and trust structures, as well as native title party aspirations becoming more sophisticated in line with that. A quick roundup in terms of trends coming out of those things. Negotiations are being driven by, definitely think being driven by increased expectations around financial and non-financial benefits. There is significantly greater awareness amongst traditional owners around market benchmarking of financial benefits, and much more concrete contracting and employment opportunities being sought. So once upon a time, employment seemed to be always drafted in a best endeavours sense, but we're really seeing a lot more now of real targets supported by shortfall penalties if proponents don't meet traditional owner employment targets that are agreed to in return for the consents to the relevant grants. Native title parties are also taking a much greater interest in applying a lot more scrutiny in relation to what they consent to. So it's not just the benefits that are of interest, but the breadth of the acts that are consented to, areas to be impacted, and the duration of a project. Review arrangements in agreements are becoming far more meaningful and not just something that are dealt with lip service. So there's potential back to market reviews and reviews that really analyse whether benefit arrangements such as employment and contracting opportunities have actually borne fruit 3 to 5 years on. Interestingly, native title party negotiators more and more are the directors of the prescribed body corporates that hold native title on trust or as agent for the group. And they're increasingly conscious not just of, once upon a time, they were, and still are always conscious of their cultural and familial responsibilities as negotiators, but increasingly also of their professional responsibilities as directors in how they approach engagement. With free, prior and informed consent, expectations, negotiations are changing in a way that a lot of fallback options are taken off the table by proponents. Proponents are less readily willing to rely on fallbacks such as going through the Native Title Tribunal, and opportunity costs seems to be becoming the only form of leverage. Interestingly, case law developments around native title compensation, which we're starting to see methodologies provided by the courts, aren't necessarily delivering greater certainty for methodologies to structure deals, particularly in the resources space, because whilst we've got cases underway in Queensland, up around Boulia for the Pitta Pitta people, Gove in the Northern Territory, and one in Western Australia around native title compensation for the grants of exploration and mining tenure. None of those have been determined yet. So that's a watch this space in terms of what that means for native title agreement making in the resources space. But one thing we are seeing is from the emerging native title compensation litigation is government taking a greater interest in this area. And it does raise the spectre that governments may take steps to pass through native title compensation liabilities for granting exploration and mining tenure, and that's hardwired into Western Australian legislation. And there's already the potential in Queensland for conditions on renewed or varied tenements. Finally, a couple of comments in relation to what this means in the Aboriginal cultural heritage space. We're very much seeing Aboriginal parties being very much aware of their rights under alternative remedies. We're seeing greater uptake of Aboriginal parties not satisfied with state regimes and seeking ministerial directions under Commonwealth legislation. We've also seen the first remediation and restoration order under the Queensland legislation that's been in place for 17 years. And it's only in the last couple of years we saw the first remediation and restoration order for harm to Aboriginal cultural heritage in the Oswald's Quarries case. Probably touch on Duncan Gorge just to close. And I think one of the major things coming out of that exploration and mining proponents need to consider going forward is the increased realisation that agreements in relation to Aboriginal cultural heritage can't be static and need to respond to new information in relation to Aboriginal cultural heritage significance, and particularly as was the case at Duncan Gorge, where the studies carried out and the agreements is reached, and that's essentially put on the shelf for a prolonged period of time before the project actually delays. So the emergence of new information around significance, it really needs to be front of mind. So that's essentially what I wanted to cover.
Thanks very much, Scott. Did you want to say anything to finish up, Greg? We've pretty much eaten into all of your time, so.
Yeah, no, that's right. No, I don't have a lot to say other than to go back and say Aboriginal people have a lot more access to information now, and so that it's a dynamic playing field, as it were, to move projects forward. So thanks very much, Rick. Sorry, I talked on a bit long.
No, it's great. I found it to be really, useful, and probably a very good way for us to start, because it sort of shows, I think, what a lot of the exploration people in the audience, where it probably certainly mimics my experience in terms of engagement with stakeholders on projects where you're in a situation where you basically learn through the school of hard knocks. So I'm hoping that if anyone has any questions, now would be the time to ask Greg or Scott, because we're going to lose them in a second. So please, I've got a couple, but I want to give the audience a chance to. So if you have a question, please type it in the Q&A, and it'd be great to see it. And while we wait for that, I'll ask one of mine. This is really for both of you, but I've been involved a little bit in the access agreement process and seen how it proceeded in the cases I was involved in, and more recently in the last little while. And I know that each group is different, but I've spoken to some traditional owners, and their perspective was still that they felt they had they still felt they had very little control in the process. It kind of made me think. I was listening to Radio National driving in this morning, and Noel Pearson was being interviewed and he was quoting from the Uluru statement saying, this is a torment of our powerlessness, that there are still a lot of groups that feel like they don't have the power to take control of an agreement or to not accept an agreement that doesn't suit them. And I was just wondering, for either of you, does that strike a chord with your experience? Or is it something that, it sounds like from what you're saying, it's something that from your perspective we made a bit of progress on in the last little while.
Yes. So from myself, Rick, I'd say that all those groups are becoming more knowledgeable. Perhaps there were perceived powerlessness because the native title conveners of the meetings perhaps hadn't communicated fully with the affected people. And as they get better resources and more experience, I think that gap would be diminishing. From my side, I certainly feel they are aware that they can ask for things and direct the traffic and stop the process if they so choose.
Yeah, and I'd endorse that. I think from the other side of the table as well, it is very much a factor of change, particularly where corporates do have pressure from institutional investors and other stakeholders to adopt different approaches, and we're seeing that more and more.
Okay, yeah. We don't have any questions in the Q&A, but anybody from the panel want to ask any questions? If
I was thinking of one, and I was wondering from both of your experiences, every state is different, and they all have, different rules. There are broad similarities, but there's different rules. There's different kind of standards in terms of compensation that's allocated to landholders or cultural heritage groups. And I was wondering if you could comment, either of you, either Greg or Scott, on the role of government in these processes and where there might be areas for improvement or areas to build upon.
Scott, have you got time to comment?
Yeah, I think probably in the sense of the role of government as a proponent is certainly going to get more interesting. Obviously, government has the ultimate fallback in relation to government projects in terms of compulsory acquisition and things like that. So it will become far more challenging for government as a proponent, as it, whilst it's not subject to institutional investors and things like that, it's obviously subject to the electorate, and it should be adopting similar approaches, I think, to its negotiation, which means moving away from leaning on fallbacks. So there's definitely big implications for government there. Generally speaking, for the private sector, we've seen things are structured in a way that government doesn't have a visual on the commercial arrangements that are entered into with native title parties in the private sector, even where the government has to be a party for legal reasons. So at this stage, we're not seeing the government, vetting outcomes and things like that. But it's certainly the case that it's open to native title parties to lobby government to take a greater interest in those things if that becomes necessary. Helen.
And from my side, I'd say that the communication between all the native title party groups and Indigenous people in general facilitates, everyone's pretty well benchmarked. They know what's out there and being asked for. And so that provides both the benchmark, and also when people come up with a novel mechanism, then that actually gets talked about. So I think that it's a self-governing thing in that way, as long as minerals companies want to access land and the groups are aware of what deals are being struck, both in Australia and globally.
As a follow-on to that, Greg, I know that there are big differences in compensation between areas that have a high density of gas exploration, for example, versus mineral exploration. And I know that for some mineral explorers, they, there seems to be a sort of an escalating cost as cultural heritage groups and landowners see what the people in the gas fields are getting and sort of, and feel that the same sort of, or that the activity in the minerals space should reflect that. Whereas, do you think there's a role for an education piece around the differences in those types of exploration or operations and the impact of those activities?
I would say certainly is. I mean, from a landholder perspective, you can deal with that to some extent through the land court if you need to go that far. But certainly with the native title groups, well, the education process can be more protracted and difficult.